Welcome to Fields of Consciousness, the podcast for consciousness conversations with myself, Jeffrey Stegman,
and myself, Clayten Stedman.
As consciousness explorers and founders of Focus Life Force Energy, we're here to bring a holistic approach to consciousness and share practical examples of how you can take your life to the next level. From your home to your coworkers, let's explore together how consciousness interacts with your everyday experience.
In our last episode, we discussed a bit more about who we are and our interest in consciousness. In this episode, we dive deeper into high and low consciousness fields, how living in a high consciousness field benefits you, and why we believe environment is more important than your personal will. Welcome to the podcast.
Welcome back to Fields of Consciousness. We're happy to be with you. We're your hosts, Jeffrey and Clayten. Today we're going to talk about the relationship between the consciousness of your environment and your personal willpower. So Clayten, this idea that our environment around us is more important than our willpower just blows me away. Can you explain that to me?
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. When we're talking about environment and willpower, we often forget to think of the long-term influence of a place. We typically will associate it with an immediate kind of feeling of a place. If we're talking about environment, like, is it decorated well? Is it clean, I suppose? And there's certainly an effect that happens when we go into a place that's beautiful or really chaotic. And it's the long-term consequences of different environments. I think that is probably underrated more in our Western culture. In the Eastern cultures, where they talk about feng shui, in particular the Asian cultures, it's a big part of their conversation. There's feng shui, there's vastu, there's different disciplines that are thousands of years old in terms of how you orient your house and where you put different objects. It's just a different focus on the relationship with the land. The Native Americans certainly have a very strong connection to the land, and that's one of the gifts of their culture. And even they have places in the world where they don't suggest people live. Right? It's just not good energy. And there's a history of illness in those places and discord. So those are some just kind of cultural, geographic, historical precepts that we all live within, sometimes unconsciously.
In pilgrimage sites around the world, people go to those environments, for different purposes. We've talked about that in past episodes. Yeah. And so we're talking about fields of consciousness on the land or in a building that can affect us. So, these thought forms is the other part of that. There could be just a way of thinking about something that, is showing up in our thinking, and it's related to the land or to the place. But how do willpower and this environment kind of, interplay, in our personal energy?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned thought forms. So if we're really paying attention to our thinking when we go to a place, our thinking typically starts to change after our energy is depleted a bit or raised a bit. Sometimes there's a subtle influence of more of a thought rather than an energy, but it typically follows energy, at least in my experience. So if your thinking begins to change and your thoughts become more negative, if you're more judgmental, more critical of self and others, if you're less optimistic about your current reality or the future, or you start replaying old stories from the past, like we've all had those experiences, then that is a diminishment of personal energy, and personal energy is related to willpower. So when we talk about high consciousness fields and low consciousness fields, we're talking in some ways about the scales of balance in our lives, of do we have the willpower or the personal energy to become our best self, or are we struggling and maybe deteriorating?
So in those environments, where say we're going more negative and we're having these thoughts that are counter to how we want to be, that it takes more willpower and can overcome our willpower in those situations.
Well, I think it can contribute to overcoming our willpower. That's a really interesting thought about, do we acknowledge that a space wore us down so much that we made a choice that we wouldn't, that we're not happy with. It's kind of it's not quite chicken or the egg, but if your energy is low, it's harder to manage your thoughts. If your thoughts start to change, even some of the unconscious patterns that come up, then there's a direct relationship, and sometimes it's hard to know if like what's the biggest influence. If we've had a tendency or a habit for years and years, and we go into an environment and then it gets triggered, at some point we're ultimately responsible no matter what happens. But that is an interesting distinction, Jeff. That's a good conversation, that one.
And this, like you mentioned, triggers that could be triggered by an environment that then kind of take you down a road, down a thought pattern that you might have had. I was thinking about going to like a high school reunion in the high school, so you got the same space that you were in maybe when you had a difficult time in high school. But the triggering is interesting because it may, there's all these different areas of our consciousness, and that's something I learned from you and, the work you've done in sort of delineating those different areas of our life, of our consciousness, that it could be in a certain area that we're triggered, and that we use our willpower, say, in a social situation. Some people have social anxiety, and I'm more of an introvert. If I'm in a big party, I'm like usually in the corner until I find one person to talk to, And then when I find that one person, I have a great conversation. But
I'm the person in the other corner.
Well, we found each other, which is great.
And then there's those people, like your daughter, Madeline. She's just like kind of like a social butterfly. She bounces around, makes everybody feel good. So that's an example of someone who's really high in social. They have a great appreciation for the connection with other people, the joy of humanity merging in a social situation. It's really, it's great to see.
So in that field of high social, like a high level of consciousness and social, where there's a lot of acceptance for everyone and inclusion of everyone, that me in that field, then I could start to move into, it's like better than willpower. It's like now I'm just naturally being more social.
Yeah, they lift us up. They lift us up. Those people. It's like people who are really healthy. If you're looking to find an exercise buddy for a while, if you can find someone that's much healthier than you, they're working out a lot and they're used to working out, they have a good pattern, a good routine. It's just easier to be around them because they don't have a lot of, they've overcome their stories and their resistance to exercise, right? So that's another example if we're talking about,
Yeah. And we've talked in the past about someone that's very high in, say, financial management,
Hmm.
and you take a course with them or you go see them talk, that just being in their field then helps you to be better financial manager of your money and your savings or whatever it is you're spending. That field then, where before your willpower, you were using your willpower to try to save, and it wasn't working because there, whatever, for whatever reason, some
Hmm.
kind of pattern was happening. But then when you're in that field of someone else, that environment of someone that's high in financial, then all of a sudden it's easier to do those things.
Yeah, we're sort of going into some pretty self-evident examples. There's, if we just think about a situation, if we're in a restaurant and a couple is fighting, like what does that do to the environment?
Mm-hmm.
If we're in if our home hasn't been cleaned in a long time and we come home, like I know what my experience is. People can think for that for themselves. Um, I don't know who was famous for this, Jeff, but I keep hearing that. Um, where if you want to know who you are in the world, and we have our own perceptions of who we are, and then there's the other perceptions of who we are. If we look at the 5 people close to us, or the 6 people,
Mm-hmm.
whatever that number is, that can tell us a lot about ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm. In the example of a party, it's like
yeah,
we were just talking about the social aspect. Lots of good interactions. What does that do?
yeah, yeah. These are just ways for all of us to think about fields in a way that it's it might be an unconscious perception or an unconscious experience that you have. So when we're talking about high consciousness fields, people, it's like, well, what is this high consciousness field thing? What's a low consciousness field? We're actually, human beings are consciousness research organisms. And we're just using a language such as high consciousness field or low consciousness field as we give more examples to give you the distinctions about what's happening that you're aware of. I mean, humans
Mm-hmm.
are extraordinarily sophisticated in our ability to adapt and survive. You know, um,
Mm-hmm.
we may not look that sophisticated at all times, but we, yeah, as a species, we're animals, and there's a part of our instinctive nature that's looking for safety and
Mm-hmm.
acceptance because that helps our survival.
Mm-hmm.
So we're just trying to put some language to this so we can go deeper into some of the useful distinctions.
Well, and becoming conscious of these influences then helps us to use it to our advantage,
Yeah,
to grow in the ways that we want to grow, or to be the kind of person that we want to be. All right, what kind of environment do I need to be around to be better, in this area
yeah,
that I've picked? Um,
yeah,
well, let's talk about some of the low environments. Um, so it can be low in consciousness, the way we measure consciousness. People tend to think of vibration too. They might say that, it feels low in vibration here, or it might just be like we talked about different areas of our consciousness. It's just low in a certain way that triggers us individually to go kind of drop, not feel good about ourselves, or some be in fear or something like that.
yeah. There's the objective low consciousness measurement, and if you've been in a in a certain environment for a long time and you associate that with friends and family and the good things in life that you've experienced, it may be relatively low, like um, let's say there's a home or an apartment that you you've lived in for a long time and you've had a lot of good memories there, but it's really kind of, the neighborhood's gone down. You haven't taken care of your place. Your furniture is, kind of beat up. It needs to be painted. It's dirty. You might feel comfortable in that, and it may not necessarily be high. So there is a distinction between what we're used to and what we feel comfortable with, and what is high and low. Uh,
Hmm.
Typically, people in those environments will, they'll have a pattern where they've been stuck in for a while.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that you have to have, a really nice place to be a high conscious person. It's just that, when things aren't cleaned, eventually, like, how do you feel?
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah, I was thinking too of friends that I've had where the family just fights all the time, or it
yeah,
seemed to me like they were fighting. There's these like spirited arguments and um, high, raising the pitch or the volume of the voices. And when I go into that environment, it's like, yeah, I just want to leave out the back door,
yeah.
go hide in the basement or something. But it's an environment that they're used to, and maybe even thrive on that energy of that. Um, so yeah, whether it's kind of low in vibration or maybe just a different style or a different level of consciousness in social, creates a field that's, you know, difficult for someone to be in who's not used to that.
Yeah, they've maybe got a thicker skin by being in that environment all the time, and
Mm-hmm.
they may have a way of relating that I wouldn't probably enjoy either. It may not be that low. It can just be a very blunt kind of style of relating, or a
Mm-hmm.
caustic, or they call it a sense of humor, and it can be really critical. So sometimes it's just a style of relating, and sometimes people try to rationalize the bad habits. That's the way we are. We've always been that way. It's our way of talking to each other. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, well,
Mm-hmm.
uh, yeah, and those people may be really smart with their money.
Mm-hmm.
So it's humans are interesting. We have these areas where we can be really well resourced, and other areas where we just, yeah, we're struggling.
So the low consciousness or low energy field, we've talked in past podcasts about the feelings, can feel heavy. As you said earlier, you might have these negative thoughts coming in that, you could maybe see if they're yours or not. They might not be
Hmm.
yours. You might be distracted, be less compassionate in that situation. Have you ever noticed that, Clayton?
Oh yeah, the mind loves to jump to judgment, or to make up assumptions before checking the
Mm-hmm.
data. Yeah, the mind's great for that. And anytime you're in a lower vibration area, you've got to be a little more diligent about managing your thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I've even noticed, like up here, Jeff, we've got a really bad fire season this year up in British Columbia, and well, a lot of places do, but we're certainly one of them. And the level of conscious of the town has dropped, like that
Mm-hmm.
we're in. In fact, this part of the whole country's dropped. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
the province has dropped about 90 points. The province of British Columbia, since the severity of the fire season has kind of kicked in. So that's another example of, you know, people don't want to go out that much because it's really smoky, and
Mm-hmm.
it's really hard to exercise outside, or even in a lot of places if you don't have good ventilation, it's really difficult to exercise. And
Mm-hmm.
we heard today that what Denver has the lowest air quality in the United States.
I think in the world is
The
what I
world?
heard.
Okay, yeah. Well, Castlegar, not too far from here, had the lowest air quality in Canada last week.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just a
Mm-hmm.
real, kind of visceral example of, is fresh air and sunshine, or even, rain, because that nourishes the earth, is that, a higher field or a lower field, and is, smoke from fires that clogs your lungs and makes your eyes irritated, and or makes it
Mm-hmm.
difficult for you to breathe. That's a pretty dramatic example.
Yeah, dramatic example of an unhealthy, environment or a low environment or triggering emotions and, into, complaining, I guess is one way to look at
Yeah.
it. I'm not saying you were complaining, Clayton, but it could lead to, patterns. No matter what our willpower is, it's like the environment is just so big and so kind
Mhm.
of overwhelming in our consciousness that it can create that kind of reaction.
Yeah, it was, the people that I talked to, it was like, geez, we spent so much time inside the last winter with, all this, self-isolation. And then summertime comes and it's smoky. It's like, give us a break, So there's a certain amount of commiseration there for sure. But I was thinking about, we talked earlier about being around people who, they eat really healthy, you tend to eat healthier. If they don't tend to eat healthy, you tend to eat, less healthy. And I'm thinking about in high school, the smoking pit, they called it, where everybody go outside, smoke. And it was just like, there was kind of a gossipy kind of a vibe out there. And, I didn't smoke either, but some of my friends hung out there. And so when I went out with them once in a while, and it's just, it's like not a space you want to spend a lot of time in. And I'm also thinking about parties, Jeff. Oftentimes people are drinking or at a party or using some type of stimulant. And the party becomes, it's like it goes up and up and up, in energy or vibration. And then it turns, and sometimes it's pretty obvious. And sometimes it's not so obvious. But I had a buddy of mine that I knew for years. And when we went to a party, he was a musician, right? And, he grew up in a musical family. So he was a professional partier, put it that way. And as soon as the party turned, he would know it. He was like a sixth sense. And then he'd point out all the behaviors of people, like how it turned in the last 20 minutes. And then he would leave. And he said, I've been in too many situations where, the music was great. People are having a good time. They're having a few drinks or whatever they're having. And then all of a sudden, it turned. And
So it's an example of paying attention to the environment. And when it hits that point, exit, head for a different environment.
Yeah.
Find another party that's just started.
That's right.
That's how those all night long things get going.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So being around people, that, like, say the eating example. So would that be like a level of consciousness in health that would be part of that field, that would be part of the environment that would affect you? And say you're with someone that's, has bad eating habits or has some ideas about eating that maybe aren't that healthy. So would their level of consciousness in health be what's affecting us in maybe, joining them in not eating? I mean, there might be some social aspects in that as well, but
food's an interesting one. So, the economics come into play, and belief systems, of course, what's healthy and what isn't. And, food's such a common one, so it's a great example. If you're really grateful for the food you have and you're not eating too much of the, I think acknowledged unhealthy types foods, typically, complex carbohydrates, and people talk about donuts and things like that as an example. If you're grateful to be able to afford that donut and you haven't had anything much to eat that day, it might be different than, sneaking off into the corner to have a couple of donuts before you go to the gym and hit the juice bar. In the same way with people that are quite healthy, if they're neurotic about their food and they're, sometimes when you're changing your diet, you really got to focus a lot of energy on it and you got to plan your meals and do all that. And that's tension creating in itself because you're trying to change. And I've been around some people who appear to be very healthy. And I believe that sometimes their neurosis around having to eat the right kind of food almost taints the food in their body because of the tension. So it's kind of an interesting thing. It's not just what we put in our body, it's the state that we're in when we eat it. But
So the level of consciousness, you might be in fear. If I don't eat this way, I'm going to die. Is the unconscious maybe belief pattern. So that would be in a lower level of conscious fear, even though they're healthy eating.
yeah,
Yeah, so it's something you could learn from them. But I remember when the kids were growing up, I was I wouldn't say militant is the right word, but I was pretty, I wanted good food and good eating, and it probably was too. I don't know if I got quite to the neurotic stage. I have to ask others for their opinions about that, but yeah, I mean, down that road of really intensity around it, and it has the opposite effect. Then
yeah.
it's like, well, I'm going to go the other way. Then so food is interesting. We have a lot of survival, you know, beliefs around it, maybe unconscious, and then what we learned from our parents and friends and everything else.
Advertising. I mean,
Mhm.
yeah, when Wayne Gretzky says eats the, well, I used to Wayne Gretzky when I was a kid. When he says eat Honey Nut Cheerios, well, it must be good for you.
Mhm.
Wayne says so.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah. So the other, low kind of areas around people, like whether it's roommates, friends, a group of friends you're around, or people at work, workmates that where there's a lot of complaining happening, like especially in a work environment, it can be this, field of complaining, you could say, or an environment of fault finding
hmm
in them, the the owners or the managers, um, that can create an environment that may be difficult for your willpower to overcome, or you have to spend a lot of energy to not, jump on that wagon.
yeah, if you have unresolved authority figure issues, you're going to find an authority figure to project it on. So if you have to own the business, it's going to be you. Um, yeah, unless they find somebody else, And well, if they don't heal it within themselves, they'll just keep finding more and more people to project that on. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
So what Dr. David Hawkins is somebody we follow, and the book Power versus Force is the first one. If you haven't read any of his work, it's great to read. But what's his broken window theory? I've heard that, but I don't really understand it.
Yeah, it's a common theory. It's the I think I read it first in his book, and I looked it up. And it's basically if you're in a neighborhood and somebody breaks breaks a window. And I think the example was in an apartment building. Somebody threw a rock through a window, and they don't fix it. And then what tends to happen is that broken, unrepaired items that are visible, especially, will tend to attract other circumstances that are similar. So what happens is that, well, there's a broken window, so the person doesn't make the effort to fix it. And then they don't make the effort to fix that fence outside, and there's, something happens with the fence. And then they're not making the effort to cut the grass or whatever. And it just
Mm-hmm.
leads to more and more, I don't know, disrespect or lack of care for the environment.
Mm-hmm.
And the opposite is the same. They found that if somebody, if there's a broken window or something that needs repair, just physical stuff in an environment, if you take care of the physical environment, people will tend to take more care of the physical environment. It's a sort of a law of attraction, that the neglect attracts more neglect, and the high maintenance, the positive maintenance on something attracts more positive maintenance.
When we've noticed in the FLFE field, in the FLFE high consciousness environment, that people take care of it more. That they're there's something about a high consciousness field that has people clean and paint and renew the environment. Do you think that like a broken window in this situation is lowering the level of consciousness of the environment there?
Yeah, I think anything that's um, neglected in terms of maintenance would drop the level of consciousness. Yeah, that's what I believe. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. Don't tend to think about, physical things like that and consciousness together, but as we've found out and through study that fields of consciousness are everywhere, and they're not just around living things. It's part of our whole environment.
Yeah, I mean, thoughts are things. So if you have a broken window, it's like you're looking at that and you're going, okay, that person either doesn't have the money to fix it or they don't care. But your thought that's projecting towards that building with the broken window is typically not, oh, what a lovely building. Like, look at how well they take care of that. Oh, they chose a nice color for the, for the trim, or it's just well respected. And so thoughts are things. And I think that negative thought that's repeated over and over again, especially if it's in a visible place, starts to create an energy about it. I mean, humans are extraordinarily powerful. Even when we're unconsciously looking at something and just analyzing it, you don't have to be judgmental about it. It's like, oh, okay, there's a lot of things that are broken in that place. People aren't, they either don't care, don't have the money, or something's going on.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. That passerbys are adding to the the thought forms or level of consciousness around that area that doesn't look good, broken windows, whatever's broken.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's really interesting. So let's move on to some higher, let's get out of the heavy. Sometimes in our work, we've had to understand the low and the heavy to help clear it, or to create a high consciousness field that transcends that. But I'd certainly like spending more time on the highs.
Yeah, I think with the lows, even like you can get a lot of juice from being in a low field, right? You get a lot of juice from being a victim, and it's these fields are very a lot of entrainment happens. The more you spend time in a certain field, the more you'll want to spend time in that field.
Yeah, you get the kind of energy like you scare yourself in a graveyard and you just run as fast as you can. you're like sprinting at the speed you can never do normally. So that adrenaline,
horror movies,
kind of energy.
Horror movies remind me of that all the time. I could never figure out as a kid, like we would go to this one guy's place and watch horror movies. And then one time, it was like a basement. It was like a daylight basement. And he came to the, it was a lot of stabbing in the movies. I can't remember which one it was. And he came to the window with one of the, the kitchen knives from upstairs, and he shined a light on the knife and hit the window and like started going, up and down, stabbing motions in the window with the light on it. And I think that was the last time I went over. It was like, okay, where's this going to end up? It's like Russian roulette coming or whatever. But yeah, it was pretty shocking at the time. And actually, we had a good laugh at it, but it's just getting kind of weird. There's other things that happen, contribution to that. But
I mean, it's interesting, these low fields and low examples there. There's low energy, and it can trigger those survival responses, which can give you bursts of energy.
Oh yeah,
but it's kind of a temporary thing, right? Where the high fields and the low ones are, making your personal energy lower, your willpower more difficult to overcome and be the person you want to be. So in these higher consciousness fields, then there's more energy available, more positive, feelings and thoughts too, right?
Yeah, it's more abundance. There seems to just be more possibilities. Gratitude, I think, would be another characteristics of a high field. People are happier. I think we talked about your daughter, Maddie. She calls it flow all the time, synchronicities. I mean, our friend Gary, our synchronicity guru, he's noticing synchronicities all the time. He's really a little wired for that. Some things fall into place easily, and there's all these patterns that show up. And it's easier to connect with people and be more relaxed, to talk to each other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah,
So that, the beginning of the party, when the
yes,
party's first starting and there's
yeah.
the social is getting going and there's fun, exciting people to talk to. There's that happy flow feeling and, noticing those synchronicities and energized feeling. And that kind of energy in those higher fields, it seems like it's a longer term energy, right? It's supporting our personal energy and our personal will. That there's just, when you're not in it's like a survival kind of, whether it's unconscious or conscious triggering, that we can be our higher selves, we can be our best selves more easily.
Yeah, if you've ever been to a good party, you can be, it can last for days, that feeling, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a celebration of life. I mean, humans are social creatures. We need each other.
Mm-hmm.
We need interaction. I mean, I think one of the worst
Mm-hmm.
things you can do is put someone in isolation. That's what they do in prison as a punishment. I mean, some people
Mm-hmm.
manage it better than others, but I recall history of prisons. I was watching a documentary on it, and I thinking it was New Zealand, Tasmania, where their idea of putting people in prison was just to put them in these individual cells and isolate them and keep them away from everybody. Just bring them food and water, and the suicide rate was just extraordinarily high. And that's when I realized that you're not going to rehabilitate anybody that way.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a death sentence for many people. So that's
Mm-hmm.
it's just an example of how people are wired to interact, and
Mm-hmm.
hanging out with each other is just part of the joy of life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in we talk about different aspects, and the party is that connecting person to person and social and relationships. Building relationships and connections with people. Um, and then we've talked about high fields related to the grace of the guru kind of situation.
Mm.
We talked about Amma the hugging saint in past podcasts, and what other high fields have you experienced around people?
Mm.
I know we talked about Dr. Hawkins.
Yeah,
Can you think of others, Clayton?
I think we've told the Dr. Hawkins story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we've talked about going to a seminar where somebody is an acknowledged expert in the field,
Mm-hmm.
and they share a perspective on something. Um,
Mm-hmm.
like we have a community futures here in town, which helps entrepreneurs get their businesses started and teaches them various things about different parts of business. So you have your accountants and website developers, search engine optimization specialists, maybe an overall marketing person.
Mm-hmm.
So these people have been trained professionally typically, or they have their sort of natural ability in conjunction um, with educating themselves. They demonstrate excellence in an area, and eventually they
Mm-hmm.
might get asked to teach that, or they
Mm-hmm.
pursue teaching it because they have a
Mm-hmm.
knowledge that is been demonstrated as true. Hopefully, it's some
Mm-hmm.
practical knowledge. I always appreciate people like that, but
Mm-hmm.
in that situation, it is practical. They're hiring people that have actually succeeded in those areas. So that would be an example of, we may not think of it as the grace of the guru in the West, but in the East, they may call that person a marketing guru, whereas we think of people
Mm-hmm.
as gurus we associate with spirituality, and
Mm-hmm.
so those would be
Yeah, we
individuals. Yeah.
we have our research guru, Dr. Gary Schwartz, that we're
Yes.
working with,
Yeah.
and just being even a short meeting with him, the insights around research and conducting scientific research in really, integrous, really complete ways, kind of the gold standard of doing research that can be reproduced by others and stands up to scrutiny. Um, he just radiates that. It's just like being around him is just like an instant boost in thinking about or just doing the research and designing and doing the research that's on our evidence page. But the other person that comes to mind for me is you, Clayten. When we first met, your level of consciousness or your abilities in the area of personal development, were really sort of rubbed off on me, and helped me to move forward with my own personal development. But I believe you were holding a high field in personal development because that's what you were doing. You're coaching people in that area, and it just like was an immediate boost for me.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, you spend thousands and thousands of hours on something, and you develop distinctions and levels of discernment. Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Most days I would agree with you. Some days.
We're all human and have our ups and downs. One of the ups I've heard from you is this pancake breakfast on July 1st, Canada Day.
Yeah.
Now, I've never been up for that. What's that like?
Well, so I live in Nelson, British Columbia, Canada. It's where the FLFE head office is, and it's 10,000 people. And a lot of these small towns, they have their main street, and it was the center of the distribution of ore in the area. And so it had, a lot of nice architecture. There was a lot of, kind of money moving through the area at one time. And Baker Street is, our main street in town, and it's lined with, quite nice architecture, a lot of brick buildings. And so you have this, this quintessential small town main street. And on, July 1st, which is Canada Day, I think it's a Rotary Club, puts on a pancake breakfast. And there's probably 500 people in line, which is like, you think of a town of 10,000 people, that's a lot of people. And there's a guy on, the block that they serve it on. He owns a restaurant. I think it's Cam's. And Cameron helps out with his kitchen to, help with the pancakes. They got this great big pancake maker and all these dozens of people volunteering. And there's somebody in line usually handing out Canada flags, really tacky kind of Canada flags. And all the kids are face painted, not all the kids, but people are face painted. And there's a whole itinerary for the day. There's, the pancake breakfast, and then you go to we have a park called Lakeside Park. You go there, and the mayor and the council, they have the big Canada Day flag, and they have the big Canada Day flag. Yeah, they have the big Canada Day cake. They cut the cake. It's standard stuff in any hometown. Or any small town. It's just one of my favorite days of the year. There's this whole itinerary they print in the paper, and you can go from event to event to event. And in this park, they have, vendors, and they have the fire department and Kootenay Lake Stewardship Society, and they have a balloon, a tent where you go in and play with balloons, and it's just a lot of fun. It's one of my favorite days of the year. And I don't do well with pancakes, but that's one of the days where I take digestive enzymes and go and eat my pancake breakfast. And it's just great. It's just a celebration of, the country and the town. And I just love it. I love going to pancake breakfast. It's just that small town, simple, down to earth. Yeah.
So knowing you, Clayten, I'm sure you've calibrated the level of consciousness of Pancake Breakfast Canada Day. What happens during that day?
Oh, God, I forgot to mention that. So Canada Day is the highest consciousness day of the year in Canada. Now, the second highest day is Christmas. Now, there's been years when Christmas Day is higher than Canada Day for some reason, and maybe there's something going on politically. And the week leading up to Christmas is the highest day of the year. Sorry, the highest week of the year. Yeah. And that's the pattern we see everywhere, Jeff. It's usually the birthday of the spiritual leader of the majority of people in the country. That is the highest day. And then there's typically holidays before that. Like when I lived in the Middle East for a while, I think it was Eid. It led up to the birthday of Muhammad. And that was the highest day of the year. And it's interesting that you can have a country that's, someplace in the world, it could be 150, 180 out of 1,000 on the Hawkins map of consciousness. And on that day, it would be over 500, which is love on the Hawkins map. So, you got street festivals, you've got all kinds of events happening. People are on holidays. There's it's usually lots of parties, lots of great food. And that's a great example of a high consciousness field.
So in that field, our personal energy is lifted, our level of consciousness is lifted. I kind of think of personal energy as like, well, how much get up and go do we have? How much kind of functioning and ability to go and do things, and level of consciousness as we move up into that 500 and above level, just feel a lot of love towards everything and everyone.
Yeah, I mean, one of the examples that I was just thinking of high consciousness fields is when I first went to your family's companies. And we talked a little bit about this before, but there was, you were introducing me to people, and this is Fred, he's been here 37 years. This is John, he's been here like 17 years. This is, Bob or Mary, they've been here 24 years. I mean, I've never been in a company where you had so many long-term employees. And I thought that was, this said a lot about you and your family, how you'd created that. And that's a very practical example of just having a company that's run well. People are treated with respect. They certainly seem to be happy there. Not just because you were showing me around. I just thought they were generally kind of nice people. And the tenure was something I hadn't experienced before. So,
there's a field that exists, and with a company that's been around that long as well. Yeah. There's that history, and it's been in the same building a long time. That field of consciousness grows there, and people can make a living, take care of their families, and express themselves at work and through their careers. And so I'm sure it's true other places. We certainly, with FLFE, it's been quite a delightful environment to be in, because we have, of course, the FLFE environment activated on the building, our office building, but it's also all the people and the interactions, and sort of in the mission of the company. People are invested in that mission, and helping each other. And somebody gets busy, somebody else comes over to help, and there's just that high consciousness field seems to bring in these characteristics of cooperation and respect for each other, really laughter, sometimes we get going in these meetings. It's just hilarious. There's something about laughter and humor that's high consciousness.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the manifesting part, there's a lot of people that talk about ways of manifesting, and this being in a high consciousness field and rising in consciousness yourself, and then a bunch of powerful humans getting together and holding an intention for something, really specifically. Man, things seem to happen fast.
Yeah. What's interesting about kinesiology is you can, or muscle testing, you can measure the level of consciousness of the environment, and then start to tweak it, to adjust it and optimize it. And at some point it just becomes, there's a real flow, and it's just a delight. You almost, like with the FLFE office. I mean, I look forward to going into the office, and there's an energy there of getting things done, which is just makes it way easier if you're kind of, feeling sluggish, just get your body to the office, you know.
Hmm.
And that's true for a lot of places. There's just an energy of doing. So you get to tune into the energy and it carries you.
Hmm. And in that high field, we talked about in a low field, you have to use your personal willpower to kind of move your mood up, to move out of negative thoughts or negative feelings. It's just less effort, in a higher environment, that you don't have to use your personal willpower to get out of a bad mood because you're just already in a good mood, or it's just takes a little switch of thought to be in a different pattern.
Yeah, there's lots of characteristics of those high places. So there's we talked about more synchronicities. Yeah, just day to day positive living, more personal energy. Um, Manifesting seems to happen quicker in a high field, Jeff. It's
Hmm.
and in a high field, the manifesting is generally positive. I mean, quicker
Hmm.
manifesting is good as long as the you know.
Well, it comes back to watching your thoughts, because some of us have some unconscious thoughts and maybe unconscious speech patterns around, oh, there I go again, or,
Yeah.
I'm so bad at that, those kind of negative patterns in a high field, or, it's manifesting can occur.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Something to think about.
We manifest what we think about, whether we are intending to attract it or not. It's always
Hmm.
happening. So yeah, if you're in
Hmm.
a high field and you've got a particularly, uh, if you have a particularly hard time with something, it it seems to come to the surface pretty quick because things just happen faster in a high field. So
Hmm.
yeah.
So, Clayton, how do we raise the consciousness? I mean, we've got a lot of experience with FLFE, and I know you've had use some other techniques to raise the consciousness of us environment.
Yeah, I mean, I always like to start with the basics. Just we talked about before when I was in private practice, when I was wanting to grow the business. I would take everything out of my office, wipe down the walls with some water, just bless the room, thank it for helping me, make a living and have joyful, well-paid work. And I would be pretty diligent about that while I was wiping down the walls and giving thanks for all the clients. So just cleaning, just clean
Mm-hmm.
it, clean the windows, wipe down the walls. I mean, I used to dust the ceiling and take out all the furniture. That was a bit extreme, but that's it really worked. And I tend to be cluttery, so if I took everything else and only brought back in the things that I was using and cleaned every book, then that stuff I wasn't using, I'd put it in storage and I'd rotate stuff in and out of storage that I wasn't reading those books at the time. I just wanted to keep everything really current. So I would say cleaning, washing down the walls, for example. And I think we talked about rose. Like I use a product called Dr. Bonner's soap a lot. And I use the rose oil, and
Mm-hmm.
rose is the highest vibration plant.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, have you ever done a lot of smudging, Jeff? Is that something you were really into?
Smudging?
Yeah.
No. I mean, I've been around people that did it and been to various ceremonies where it was done, and so I've definitely felt the effects of it. But I haven't done it much myself. And once we were able, once we developed the FLFE technology, it just wasn't needed anymore. Um, but yeah, on Rose, I've since we talked about that Rose is the highest vibration, the highest consciousness plant. That yeah, I've been using rose essence a lot more,
Mhm.
and it certainly makes sense to use it to wash the walls down and do that. Have you noticed, like, I'm sure in your measuring, say your office, what kind of change in consciousness level you would get in a good cleaning? Is it on a scale of few less than 10 points or higher than 10 or?
Honestly, I haven't. You think as many things as I like to measure, I haven't really measured that.
Hmm.
Yeah, I noticed that I'm really grateful for the people who clean the office,
Mm-hmm.
and like we yeah, we spent a lot of resources on creating a nice environment. We happened to move
Hmm.
into an empty space, so we got it designed. We had an architectural designer, and
Hmm.
it was kind of built to suit this new office. So we have spent a lot on it, and we're just finishing up the getting art and things. So it's been so nice. I just haven't paid attention to that for years. Yeah,
Hmm.
that'd be an interesting experiment.
Now, I've never done feng shui, but I know you've done that pretty often in your where you live.
Yeah, just about every house we've done has had feng shui. We have a lady, a friend of ours, Ashley, who is a designer and a feng shui practitioner, and she's helped us with a few things just in our living room, and we want to get her to do the rest of the house. Um,
Hmm.
there's kind of a typically good design principles from what Ashley's explained is really in alignment with feng shui. And in the past, I've just had feng shui practitioners come into just about every house I've lived in for the last 15 years.
Hmm.
And some 4 or 5 times, you know, they just keep making improvements. And honestly, I think if I had to kept having them come in, it would have been even better and better and better. I just,
Hmm.
it was pretty good, and I just focused on something else. But there's a lot more in that I've explored, and I've explored it probably more than 90% of people I know. Um, I was always, I mean, sometimes the change was dramatic.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
lived in a rental one time in Kitsilano in Vancouver, up on Arbutus Street. Yeah, and this home had been a rent home for a lot of years, and there'd be a few people that would stay there like 7, 8 years, and then some people would move in, and some people would move out. It was like shared house. Nice place to live. It was really great for me and for others,
Hmm.
I think. Um, and we had a person come in and feng shui the home, and there was one kind of weird spot in the hallway, and um, yeah, people in the house knew about it. And when they came in, the story they had was that there was an argument there in the past between some people, or some people
Hmm.
had argued there a lot, and it created this really low spot in the house. And
Hmm.
so they did a process, and they cleared it, and we all in the house noticed that the house seemed very different,
Hmm.
and that was pretty dramatic. Like you got 5 people, that all experience the same thing, and you're living in the place. That's significant,
Hmm.
and it wasn't like the house wasn't loved, so to speak. One of the guys that lived there did sweats every Friday night. That's
Hmm.
sort of where I got into the smudging a lot, and some of the
Hmm.
native ways of thinking. And they would come back after the sweats, and they'd have a meal at the place. And on Saturday morning, you'd wake up, and there'd be 4 or 5 people in the living room, like staying overnight, just because they stayed late. So the house had a great feeling in it. It was a good place to live, and there was just one spot, and that was pretty dramatic. Yeah.
So, in thinking about fields of consciousness, that we've been talking about, you can kind of picture the fields and thought forms attached to it, and um, from the input of all the people that have been there and over all that time. So, how does feng shui work? I mean, is it the movement of energy into like? How does a place go up? I don't know if you know this or not. I'm just
hmm
kind of wondering, like, how does feng shui actually work with the fields of consciousness to go higher?
Well, from what I understand about it, there's certain principles where if you have a large window and you put a plant in the center of the window, your eye will tend to draw itself to the plant in the center of the window. And depending on the room and the house and where it's laid out, that will pull your energy to a nice view
Mm,
if it isn't a place where you'd naturally look. So that's an example of working with the way that humans relate to an environment to help them
mm,
appreciate the beauty that's in it.
mm.
There's just really common sense things like having furniture that doesn't get in the way of moving around properly. Colors, feng shui people talk about cleaning as well. I mean, that was one of the things that was always mentioned with the people. I tend to work with the same person, and they had been doing it for decades. And when I lived in Vancouver, I'd lived there 20 years, and so they would come over and do the place, and they would back to the basics. Okay, when you move in, if you're living in a shared house, you clean your room really well. You put your energy into it. There's also about the way that the energy runs. Like a lot of feng shui people don't suggest you live on the end of a cul-de-sac because the energy of the cars moving will tend to, kind of hit that property, if you will. Or living on a place on a highway where say the highway is going in a certain direction, there's a big bend, and the chi of the traffic will actually go beyond the road. We've used that as a geopathic stress indicator when we're writing the programs for FLFE and compensating for that. Bends and rivers, of course, Jeff, that's another one that we commonly work with. Underground movement of water will tend to pull energy away from a place because the energy is going with the water. So those are all feng shui principles.
Okay.
Yeah, geopathic stress would be part of feng shui. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. So it sounds like it's a combination of the flow of energy and the consciousness of the people living there, appreciating the beauty and not running their shins into a couch. It's in a way.
Yeah.
So it's a combination of the flow of energy and the consciousness of the people appreciating the house maybe going up.
Yeah, reasonable design principles. Yeah, plants, bringing in plants is another one. I think I talked about before, Jeff, pets. A lot of people find their homes don't feel the way they want without a pet or just living things. Like there's a difference between having a plastic plant that's green and looks good in a corner and one that's alive.
Well, there's the field of the cat purring and the dog wagging its tail. I think Dr. Hawkins talked about that kind of love. Was it in the unconditional love range?
500 anyway, for sure. Yeah. And there's probably things about feng shui, Jeff, that I'm just not thinking about in this moment to be able to summarize it, succinctly.
Yeah, I just put you on the spot there. I just was really curious about how it works with fields of consciousness, and it makes sense that the flow of energy is happening all the time around us, and if you can use that to your advantage to add to the energy of the house, or make sure that energy isn't going out the back door in a way that lowers the level of consciousness. So.
Yeah, that's right. If you have your front door and your back door aligning, and you don't tend to, if you don't find a way to manage the flow, it tends to go right out, and that affects your abundance. There's a lot of principles. The research I have done on feng shui, Jeff, the average home in North America that's feng shuied by a professional practitioner, the average home goes up 40 points.
So that's a big jump.
That's a big jump, and that's extraordinary, really. And I don't know if that, if a person came in twice and 3 times, 4 times the practitioner, if they came back, because oftentimes they'll suggest you make changes, and you make the changes, and then there's more refinements. But when I went back to the homes that I lived in, the ones that the person came back to several times, his name was Henry. He was well known in Vancouver. If he came back a couple of times, it would go up even higher. So that was just kind of testing in the past. But yeah, that's a big increase in your quality of life.
Yeah, let's talk about high consciousness fields, and the FLFE service is another way to raise the level of consciousness of the properties, and it kind of depends on where the property starts as to what the delta is, what the increase is. But the FLFE home subscription's at $560, and that's dramatically different than certainly North America's, or the United States is in the $350 range right now.
Yeah, I mean, 2019, I think the LOC of the average home in the United States was around 400. So that's a
Mm-hmm.
160-point increase. And
Mm-hmm.
of course, we know that the Hawkins map of consciousness is logarithmic. So it's 400 to the 160th power. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it's even higher now, Jeff, since the pandemic. A lot of things, the consciousness has dropped a lot. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people have found that sanctuary really, really helpful to have a high consciousness field to be in. Um, yeah, so in a high conscious field, whether you're doing feng shui or you're at a house of worship or you're in an FLFE environment, there's the things we've been talking about that we're supported to be in a better mood, to have our relationships be at a higher level, certainly in the love range, FLFE at 560. You're supported for our relationships to be loving, and that being in that field, and it's like people went to pilgrimages, for personal growth and to get closer to divinity, to all of creation, to rise, or it might have been specific health things as well, but certain places people go to really evolve. Um, and so what we've noticed is there's a personal level of consciousness effect in a high consciousness field if you spend time in it. It's like if you went to live at your local synagogue, cathedral, mosque, and you could, camp out and live in some of the highest places in those structures, that's you would be spending time in a high consciousness field. And so, we find that people's level of consciousness go up in that situation. I'd love to hear you talk more about that, Clayten.
yeah, so because we spend a lot of time measuring consciousness with kinesiology in particular. I mean, if you walk into a place and you feel good in there, it's very likely a high consciousness place. Humans are extraordinary consciousness research, uh, you know, machines. That's part of how we survive. And with kinesiology, you can get pretty specific about changes in consciousness. So, for example, in an FLFE environment, um, if you spend 8 hours a day in that environment for 90 days straight, the average person goes up in consciousness about 15 points on the Hawkins map. So the Hawkins
Mm-hmm.
map of consciousness, or the Hawkins scale of consciousness, is what we use as our control to measure that influence.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're spending 24 hours a day in an FLFE field, so a person that's just come on to the service, that person on average goes up 30 points in 90 days. So that's really quite a jump, considering, some people go up hundreds of points in their lifetime. And of course, some people go down. So when Dr. Hawkins was alive, the research that he did indicated that the average person goes up about 5 points in their lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
So being in a high consciousness field like FLFE really gives you an opportunity to accelerate your personal growth, your level of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And I know the thing that you talk about all the time, Jeff, is that's really, it's 30 to the power of 10 times more energy to create the life you want.
Mm-hmm.
That's what
Mm-hmm.
it's for. It's to help you live a more abundant life,
Mm-hmm.
in whatever way that's meaningful to you.
Yeah, and it's back to the willpower and environment. So, in that high conscious environment, the personal development is happening almost without our willpower, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you can be on your personal path, and we can talk about some of those personal paths, but in doing what you're doing, but you're not applying more willpower. It's the environment itself that is supporting you to move up more quickly, and maybe clearing those habits, or um, there's just more energy in the environment for us to use to grow, to clear those environments, just be happier in our lives, just to be in a more joyous state. Um, So yeah, that seems that extra energy we can use it for to create the life we want, the more, positive, real expression of ourselves, that, the person we want to be.
Yeah, I think there's less than 1 in 1 million homes in the world that are at 500 level of consciousness without
Mm,
some type of FLFE influence, or maybe multiple, feng shui applications. So
mm,
in most environments, we're having to give out our energy to compensate for the environment, because we're higher than the environment.
mm,
And in an FLFE environment, and 560 isn't the limit of it. We have lots. I think we have about 12% of our in our homes, Jeff, that are over 600 on the Hawkins map.
mm, mm,
So it can go up a lot higher. It's just that there's the consciousness slider that you have access to if you're a subscriber or on a free trial. It allows you to adjust the level of consciousness, and it's kind of defaulted to 560 when you start the service.
mm, and you can take it up to 570 for those keeners that want to have it at the highest possible level. Um,
Yeah.
and that's, there's a process. We haven't talked much about it so far in these discussions of fields of consciousness, about personal rising in consciousness. What is that like? And we're talking about really increased freedom, kind of freedom in our life to create the life that we want to have. Um, but along the way, there we've got habits and levels of consciousness and maybe some traumas and patterns. And as those start to change, what happens?
Well, we have these conversations with customers every day, and one of the themes is that rising in consciousness isn't always comfortable.
Mm,
As you release a negative pattern or an issue, um, there can be some rocky days, and
mm,
on the other side of that, as you transcend it, there's more freedom, more joy, uh,
mm, mm,
and it isn't always smooth. And I think
mm,
that's really well known in the consciousness or personal development community.
mm,
The people who've made changes in their life, they know the process that they've gone through,
mm,
and it can be difficult. And those of us who choose to live that life decide that it's worth it.
mm, mm.
And
Yeah, I've heard the dark night of the soul concept, where, in those big jumps, we're really taking a large jump, that the old beliefs are dying off, we're like, they're not working for us anymore, but the new ones haven't quite formed yet. And there's that more like the butterfly, the chrysalis, it's the worm has dissolved, but the butterfly's not yet formed. That can be uncomfortable.
what's that saying, Jeff? When one door opens, another one closes, but the
Hmm.
hallways are hell.
I don't think I've ever heard that before.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, it's just an important fact of life in probably all of our personal development journey. Parts of adolescence um, can be pretty painful. And as we're finding ourselves
Oh,
in
yeah.
those early teenage years, it's an example of a rising in consciousness and emotional age, and some of that struggle that can occur. Um, but as on the other side, becoming your true self and who you are and your expression, and being able to share that with others, and in a loving relationship, is really, it seems, part of what being human's all about. Is this journey.
Yeah, and if you're going to talk about high consciousness fields, low consciousness fields, and rising in consciousness, if you don't have the caveat in there that rising in consciousness is not always going to be comfortable, it's like the conversation's incomplete. You know,
Hmm. Hmm.
um, we all want to be more free, typically, and and there's a process to go through to get there, and it's not always comfortable.
So, what are some of the personal consciousness raising processes or tools that you've used in your life?
Well, we talk a lot about Dr. Hawkins in the FLFE community. So reading Dr. Hawkins' books or listening to Dr. Hawkins, he's got a lot of DVDs and CDs for sale, and there's a lot of information on the internet about him. Any high consciousness teacher, I think, if you're in listening to their material or reading their material, I think that would be one, Jeff. How about for you? What are some of the ones that come to the top of your head?
Well, when I was in high school, my mother and I did transcendental meditation. So we went and, met with the guru and got our mantras. And that practice for me really changed my life. Just that time sitting twice a day, at that time is what they recommended. It was like 15 minutes. And got longer over time, but just having that quiet time to occupy my mind with just the mantra and not be in a story or in my thoughts or in my feelings. And it really changed things for me. It just sort of opened up the view, and then I could see my thoughts arise, and then I would go back to the mantra. And I think just the experience of seeing my thoughts as not me, like as something that I can observe. Like if I'm observing it, then I'm not those thoughts. And I think that experience over time was really good for my personal development.
Yeah, that's a good example.
So that was meditation, and there's a lot of forms of meditation. And then, the work I did with you, sort of looking at where the low spots are, using kinesiology to measure those, and then using energetic medicine tools to move up or to clear those old patterns. So that's kind of what I do now, is more look for those pointers, and they can be synchronicities pointing or just a flare, like a anger flare or a fear flare or some little like bright neon light, going off in my being that says, okay, something's happening there that I need to look at and then apply some tools to, whether it's meditating about it, whether it's talking about it, or energetic medicine, releases. There's tapping, there's other energetic medicine tools, acupressure related. You've got some great tools there, Clayten, and that's been really good for me.
Yeah, you've been a real advocate of energetic medicine for sure. I remember a story one time. Somebody said that the world looks a lot different at 35,000 feet than it does when you're on the ground. And laughter, having fun, having good relationships, having a good time. There's a type of healing that happens when you're having fun and enjoy that, we may not want to be that technical about it all the time. I'm going to go hang out with my friends, have a high consciousness experience, raise my vibration, and hopefully raise my consciousness. It's like you go hang out with your friends, you have a good time, you laugh, you do whatever you do, and that inspires us, right? We're just kind of getting into a technical explanation of it here, but there's a healing that happens and joy that doesn't necessarily happen anywhere else.
Yeah, I've noticed that with dancing.
Yeah, I was going to say,
yeah. Static kind of. We've had some ecstatic dancing groups around here and in Boulder when I've been there, and yeah, just being able to just move your body to the music, just like no other thoughts in mind, and there's something really healing and freeing about just being free with your body and just letting it move.
Or even exercise. I mean, that there's a biochemical, the endorphins and increased oxygen, and there's all those things, and they contribute to a higher level of consciousness. But definitely exercise is one that, I mean, most of us feel way better if we exercise regularly.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought I should mention before I forget. I mean, probably the most powerful personal development program in the history of humanity are the 12-step programs.
Mm.
A lot of us forget that, and I don't know that they're meeting in person recently because of COVID. But there's so many 12-step programs, and
Mm-hmm.
they're proven to help people recover from,
Mm-hmm.
especially alcoholism. That's probably the most commonly known in a ways that nothing else has done that I'm aware of. And
Mm-hmm.
there's just so many. There's so many spin-offs of that.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, some of the principles there would apply in other of these things we've talked about, where we've got our personal willpower. We've talked a lot about willpower
Mm-hmm.
today, that it takes us so far, and the environment can help us to go further, to support us to go further. And it's turning ourselves over to that higher power, that personal, that you could say divine power or willpower, that, and when that occurs, that's, where the magic seems to really happen.
Yeah, to have a talk about high consciousness fields and not talk about turning your life and your will over to a power that's greater than you would be an incomplete conversation and in our life.
Mm-hmm.
We spend probably most of our meetings, we do a prayer before, maybe
Mm-hmm.
90% plus. Sometimes we forget, but
Mm-hmm.
that is kind of fundamental to the way we do life.
Yeah, I think you told me before, and correct me if this isn't accurate, but we've got our personal willpower, we've got the environment that we're
Mm.
in, and then if we turn ourselves, say we're at 500 personally, and so our willpower is at that 500 level, and then if we rise in consciousness, 30 points, then we have 10 to the 30th power more willpower there. But if we turn ourselves over to divinity in some way, however we conceive that, where does the power go? Is it 850? Is that right?
Yeah, it's called
Uh,
the spiritual will. I remember when I read
mm,
that first in Hawkins' work, it's talking about the power of spiritual will, and I mean, I had to look up what that meant. And
mm-hmm,
it's turning your will over to something correlated with divinity. They talk about
mm-hmm,
in the 12-step programs, I think, a power greater than yourselves.
mm-hmm,
And, that can be a lot of things. If you've ever been out on the ocean, if you spend enough time in the water, you're going to get humbled. There's a
mm-hmm,
power greater than us out there. You spend a lot of time in nature.
mm-hmm,
You're going to be reminded regularly that there is a power greater than us. You may not
mm-hmm,
always think it's benevolent if it's weather that you don't like or is actually dangerous. Uh, but yeah, you're absolutely right, Jeff. And our personal will is directly correlated to our level of consciousness.
mm-hmm,
So if your level of consciousness is 190, or if you have an addiction calibrates around 125 or desire on the Hawkins map of consciousness. The field, I think, in the 12-step programs, I think it's around 540, if I remember. And that's about the energy that it takes to help people transcend addiction. You need to have something that's much greater than your own will, in spite of all the suffering that may happen.
mm-hmm,
Typically, that's what I'm not an expert on addiction, but that's my understanding.
mm-hmm,
Is you need
mm-hmm,
you need help from something greater than yourself. And
mm-hmm,
of course, because we like to measure consciousness, we try to put numbers on it, and
mm-hmm.
sometimes that's really helpful. And if you're getting results, that's probably what's most important.
Sure. The numbers help me just to get sort of an idea of the scale,
Mm-hmm.
like from my personal level to this 850 is just such a huge jump in power,
Yeah.
power to create the life that we want. And so that surrender, just seeing the numbers. Maybe I've become more of a numbers person hanging around you,
Yeah.
Clayten. You must be high in the field of numbers, and you're bringing me up into that. So
I'm high in the field of numbers geekdom.
that's right. It's rubbing off on me, and it's part of how we've been able to do FLFE is with the measuring. If we hadn't been able to do this consciousness measuring, we just wouldn't have been able to create what we've created.
Yeah, 100% agree with you. I don't even know if I'd want to. It's so hard to understand some of these higher truths and what's a truth and what's a belief system. If we didn't have a way of measuring it, I don't know if I'd want to do this business.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we're reaching the end of our conversation here today, and we'd love to leave these tidbits or things that you can try at home or with your friends. So I'll start that off. That we've talked about these low and high consciousness environments, and the awareness about that. We've talked about that in previous podcasts. But then this idea of willpower, and how does that environment affect our willpower, our personal energy, maybe ability to get things done in these environments. To pay attention. First of all, how does the environment feel, and then what is it doing to you personally as far as your will?
Yeah. I think we've talked before about, humans are consciousness researching mechanisms. And in an unconscious way, we're always looking for, and that's the role of the ego, is to help us increase the odds of survival. But as we get beyond the ego and we move towards more loving ways of being, our environment and our willpower plays a more important part. And so typically we invite you to look at your life in a way that you can become more conscious of what you're doing and maybe raise your consciousness and see what that next step is in your life. And so if you'd like to do that this week, we thought we'd suggest that you look at your environment and really create more discernment around how that affects your personal willpower, your personal energy, and your ability to change.
Great. Thanks, Clayten.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Thank you for joining Fields of Consciousness, the podcast of consciousness conversations. We invite you to visit the link below the episode to experience a completely free trial of focused life force energy for 15 days.
If you like, you can subscribe to Fields of Consciousness podcast, and please tune in next time. We release new episodes every other week on Tuesdays at 11:11 a.m. PST, Pacific Time. Onward and upward.